difference. Let's start. Like every year, the 23rd rencontre are exceptional, but after all, it is true, because 700, we will be 7,000. We got a lot of people want to attend, want to participate, and they got about 100,000 people who are actually, watching the rencontre on the internet, and we are going to build a whole logic that leads us to recreate hope. The title, this session, which we do have with us in Dr. Bay, Lionel Zansou, Nachal Manith, so three key personalities in the economic world. How to hope in a world of violence. Well, this is an amazing topic, because straight from the start we are convinced that optimism is the very root of peaceful societies. But as you know, this 2.5 day conference will end with a roundtable facilitated by Françoise Benadou, our president, which will deal with how to recreate hope with 4 young people. So, out of our discussions. Well, I won't do any advertising, but it's a book you will never find again. So 5-6 years ago, I wrote a book, A World of Violence, and which in fact was against the idea about the end of the world, the end of history. History was going to stop, and the world was going to be a peaceful place. And I did not believe in that. And I thought the world was not composed of indifferent individuals, but they experience or express violence, which were expressed throughout the following years, and which is reaching a peak of violence in the last few months, especially in terms of geostrategy, but also in a large number of countries where women, and all other excluded individuals suffer from, injustice in, unjust situation. And so this is why we're going to have a discussion, a 1-hour discussion, which will start with Dr. Bay. Dr. Bay is president of Amnesty International, so we all know Amnesty International. She will talk about it for a minute, but she will mainly afterwards mention the role of NGOs to regain hope in a situation where there are a lot of violence, rampant pregnant violence, war, conflict, social fractures, and this is what we must pull out of this. That NGOs do play a major role in our society by being a clear illustration thereof. Then after that, if you agree, and even if you don't actually, Lionel Zansou, who is an eminent economist, a friend of the Cercle for a few decades now, who had an amazing career as a French and in working in ministries, or he was also an industrialist and also a financier today, and then he was Prime Minister of Benin with a lot of talent. Everything he does it with talent, and he will talk about another form of violence, which is the violence experienced by African societies vis-à-vis poverty, and how when facing such difficulties, how is it possible to basically rethink the world and find new solutions through a form of expression which carries hope and positive views. And finally, Mrs. Chani, who again was an exceptional woman, a great friend of Philippe Allion, whom I see here, great for us here. And she will talk about the suffering of women in a country she knows well, a bit that she knows well, but she will explain to us, and this is why she will be right at the heart of our discussion, the role of youth in the world. How can we react, change things, and by being alive through the this new rising of the youth, which will play a key role. By the way, I want to say that youth will be at the heart of our reflection throughout the 2.5 days. And as you know, we will have 2 specific sessions on youth that will take place on Sunday. So, this was the introduction of my 3 colleagues. They're great. I mean, I'm sure they are. Now, Dr. Bae will talk to us about what we should think about Amnesty International and NGOs in general. Thank you, Madam. You have the floor.
Merci, Professor. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to join all of you. I live in Malaysia, and I must say, I am surprised at the temperature here. It's rivaling my country, so, and maybe that's a nod to the climate change that we're all facing. So, you know, a lot of times the human rights issue in itself is sort of a tension between people of conviction, you know, behind and about human rights, and skeptics. And I think Catherine Sikkink's work is very, very fascinating, where because we're becoming better and measuring more human rights impact, the world tends to think it's getting worse. But if you compare the past to the present, there's a lot of studies that show that genocide and violence against civilians have reduced. Access to healthcare and education have increased. So she makes the argument that a lot of technical, philosophical, psychological considerations make it a bit opaque, and a lot of academics are currently working on that. I would argue that there have been, you know, especially with COVID receding, there's been a resurgence in powerful movements, women, life, freedom in Iran, that, you know, has no shortage of providing inspiration and hope for people. And I would argue that activists have made quite a difference in human well-being, you know, historically. And a lot of times there's also a criticism that human rights, the neoliberalism, it has its antecedents in the West, but actually the Americas, Latin America has played a very, very important role. It is a global phenomenon. And when we talk about the climate and everything that we're facing, none of us can get through one sector of society focusing on it. It takes all of us bringing it together. And Professor, you asked you know, a question like what NGOs and Amnesty included are doing. And in the past, sometimes we were thought of as maybe too intellectual or too distant. And you know, I'm a psychologist, I'm a trauma specialist. Words matter. How you frame the argument. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Viktor Frankl's work, Man's Search for Meaning. He survived the Holocaust, he went on to be a psychiatrist. And essentially, in a nutshell, what he says is that it is not anything that anybody does or that happens to you that determines how you feel. It's essentially how you think about it. So the framing matters. You know, when you think of disinformation, misinformation, fake news, a lot of times these arguments are won if it feels true, as opposed to just facts. So I think NGOs are and need to continue paying attention to messaging. One of the questions is, you know, what is the cost if all of us in this room don't get behind human rights? A lot of research has shown that when you ask about human rights, people think of it as abuses. But another frame to think about it is as essential rights that you have since you're born. So the framing, you know, instead of, and the theme is hope. So instead of problems, solutions. Instead of intimidation, innovation. Showing people on the ground that are not remote or sort of hierarchical, normal, common people that are making a difference. And these messages, they really, really do resonate. And, you want to think locally, act globally. So for example, we have an strong amnesty office in France. And when we survey the French people, they equate amnesty in France with freedom and democracy. So you frame the message as such, and the arguments will be won by people who shape the parameters. So I will just say as a psychologist that what you resist persists. So we need to think very carefully instead of anger, which actually makes people shut down and lose hope, and a conservative response. Having hope-inspired messages is a very effective emotion in inspiring empathy. So I'll stop there.
Lionel, your turn. Professor, Mrs. President, distinguished guests and friends. First, biographic correction. I spent less time in being Prime Minister than preparing my PhD under the control of Professor Lorenzi, actually. It so happened that was 45 years ago, so okay, doesn't help, clearly. But anyway, Madam, I'm very impressed by the fact that Amnesty International, which deals with some of the most difficult situations and attacks against human rights, through you, Madam, is sending a very positive message, hopeful message on innovation against intimidation. I think this is a beautiful phrase, and I would like to thank you for everything you do at the head of Amnesty International and for having opened this rencontre on this tone. So let me add to this okay. Well, to talk about, I want to talk about Africa. So Africa, well, there is something striking in Europe is that we always it's always the orientation of information about Africa is all about hopelessness, about violence, about death, about damages and the exceptional damages caused by climate change, around the weakness of this continent, which is basically guilty for nothing of what is happening now to it. Well, climate change is a great example thereof. We are among the weakest producers of problems and for being to correct everything that is negative and happening to us. You know, the collapse of crops yield, the erosion of coastlines, the volatile aspect of weather conditions, which cause, of course, significantly impact the food resources and so on and so forth. Of course, wars, conflicts, the unsafe situation in the Sahel or in Eastern Africa, in the Horn of Africa, and this, this war that has caused probably more than 3 million deaths in the Republic Democratic of Congo under all possible regimes for all possible reasons, and we're still very active. So this is the prism, the facets through which Europe looks at Africa with its violence and despair. But we should be cautious about having some kind of a hysterical vision about Africa in terms of risk. It should not be used by Europe or the West to accept a form of decline. We should not consider Africa as being hopeless to somewhat boost optimism in the West. So maybe should we look at well, it seems to me, says the speaker, two prerequisites when we examine the position of Africa. First, you need to know it. And it's amazing the amount of ignorance actually that prevails, and the other one is to respect Africa as well. So some progress have been made about knowledge, but the economists here I do invite them to help Africa to be known, contribute to a better knowledge about Africa. One thing that penalizes is the fact that the scoring agencies do not know us and do not consider us. Well, it's a bit of a problem, but it can be easily measured because on the equal score, our condition to access financial markets involve rates, borrowing rates, versus the other emerging countries and the other continents, developing continents. There is always an additional risk premium, or there is aspect of non-competitiveness, difficulties to create the budgetary space or framework necessary. Very often we are considered as having very high risk level. Now, when we look at the economic studies or surveys, it so happens in terms of capital yield, Africa versus the other emerging countries, Africa has a mean profitability slightly higher, actually. It so happens that in terms of the risk of failure and volumes of such failures, financial failures, we are the continent with the lowest financial risk. Well, in the current period, we are, there is no access to the financial market for Africa. There are some major countries in Africa which face a tricky situation. Egypt, the second economic power of the continent, or the good kids, of growth, such as Ghana. But this over-assessment of the African risk dates back to before that. They'll give you example of Zambia and Eritrea, who are a country with huge debts and with defects, but they're 1% of the GDP of Africa, these two countries together, and there are contagion effects of the most vulnerable situations versus the most robust situations. So it'd be good, actually, especially in the economic field, to learn and to know Africa. There are other domains where, better knowledge is required. A study was done by an economist and a sociologist from Sweden, Hans Rosling, who's called Factfulness, which has not been translated into French, and which states that knowledge about the developing world from surveys in several countries, this knowledge is actually very weak, very low, because there is some kind of snapshot, of a frozen frame, of a knowledge of the world, not about the state of knowledge or the status of knowledge of the teachers of people who today are being surveyed. But what is more difficult is about the knowledge of the teachers who train their teachers. Well, it's a bit worrying, if you want. Basically, there is a sort of a frozen frame, and this is what you were teaching me in 1978, dear professor. So some countries, are somewhat ahead, like the Scandinavian countries, but France or the States, the major European powers, are in fact among those who have the oldest knowledge level, not knowledge of 2023. So first reminder, I think, clearly, if you want to build hope, it would be a good idea to know the sources of your lack of hope. I think that would be consider people is important. In the Paris summit on June 23rd, President Cyril Ramaphosa, about the new financial pact, this idea of President Macron to try to recreate trust among developing countries, and versus some loss of faith and promises not fulfilled by Western countries. He says, I feel like a beggar. I'm treated like a beggar. I'm not a beggar. So basically, we're not beggars. Let's face it, we're not. But this is the way people look at us, the West, the international institutions. We're members thereof, we're often shareholders, and therefore Well, maybe it would be to have special currency draw to finance energy transition. They look at us like, by the FMI, who a few months said openly, now they don't dare saying it, but as beggars. So you're begging for special currencies for your development banks. You want to contribute to global inflation. Well, if the world inflation was limited to African countries, it would be very low. Today in my country, there was quick response to the adaptation to the war in Ukraine and the condition that resulted from that. Inflation is at 3%. Some countries in Africa have high inflation, but we have nothing to do. We're not contributors to the world inflation. So this notion of respect are clearly essential. The fact that we to ask for the pre-colonial art objects which were pillaged during the colonial period, if they can be returned to us, well, that's a great consideration for our history. Well, something you should bear in mind, there is something you should bear in mind, and which helps us to have hope for Africa. Basically, we were colonized, fair enough, by expeditionary forces which were minute. Why? Because at the time of the colonial scramble in the second half of the 19th century, there were less than 30 million Africans, over 300 million square kilometers. For those who have imperial dreams today, and there are some powers which go back to imperial dreams, well, I'll tell them, careful, cautious. To colonize a continent is better when there is one inhabitant per square kilometer. So don't speculate on the fact that Russia is becoming Russia again. It's a European fantasy when we want to talk about Africa. Russia does not invest, has no budget for development support, but Russia does exports only 2 or 3 products, significant, fair enough, fertilizers and gas and cereals in Africa, by the way. It's more difficult in the rest of the world. It is the shadow of what the Soviet Union was, which did not scare us at the time. So the neo-Ottomanisms, and the imperial dreams of a new power, don't be scared, and it doesn't scare us. Forget about your Chinese phobia. China is not recolonizing Africa. Ignore that, pull out of that fear, and if you stop fear, you build hope. Let me remind you one detail. The trade deficit of Europe vis-à-vis China is abysmal, sorry. Oh yes, you have to stop me. Sorry, I've got 1 minute 30 left. Remember one thing, trade deficit of the US over China is $800 billion. Remember that in an average period, trade between China and Africa is balanced. For a simple reason, is that for the time being, China is not interested by us as a market. The market, it's you, not us. We provide the raw materials of the factory of the world so that goods will be sold to you. So do not project European realities. Often, young men from great international institutions say, resist against the Chinese pressure. I said, you come from the US, from France? Do you have a PhD from MIT? Because I want to say, $800 billion, make an effort in the US. Come on, get better. So why is it interesting that through consideration and knowledge, we should try to rebuild confidence and hope together, because Africa is 3 things. First, the fact that we have a very dynamic demography. And, I'm not young, says the speaker, so I'm one in the last percentile, under 65. So I'm not representative of Africa as such as the speaker, but I'm sure there will be many African students in the room and who are representative thereof. What's important is not that we have a huge demographic growth. You'll be 2 billion, okay, it scares half of the room. Well, but it doesn't matter. What's important is that we do have less and less children because our demographic growth is based on the extension of lifespan, of life expectation, not of fecundity, which drops everywhere in Africa. What's interesting is that we are the continent which has the lowest non-active citizen supported by active citizen, and this will continue with a structure which in itself generates savings and means to invest. The second asset after human asset is we have 3-4 times growth than the European Union, but that's secondary. It's not the point. The fact that our inactive assets become active. For example, the Sahara Desert, deserts, could be sources of energy. I will. So, second asset, simply the space. Thank you, madam. So, our deserts are worth something. Our mangroves, the fact that we do not touch the jungle is unique in the world. We have assets which did not exist as economic values. And the last thing, if you want, is that we are early adopters of technologies. Don't worry about the fact that look at telcos and their utilization, digital currencies. We can be something that you see as, illiterate, but today we be among, very much like in China, those who adopt the fastest new technologies. So what economist historian called the advantage of being backward, well, becomes an advantage. You go from archaism to some form of Neolithic or Iron Age to digital, and it creates a bit of hope, Mr. President.
Abnou, if you can do your presentation, and please try to give some thought already, because we'll have a 20-minute discussion session. And so everything that is discussed now and raises a lot of questions. So please give some thought to all this for our discussion period. Hello, everybody. Thank you for the invite. I think that you know what we're talking about here, so I have to be careful. I'm from the Orient, so I have to be careful with the time that is allotted to me. So hope, yes, it's there, but we just don't see it anymore in our liberal democracies. Obviously, Ukraine, at the moment of the invasion by Russia, was an electroshock, but this shock did not come from the fact that there was a war on our continent, even though if we've forgotten about the wars in Yugoslavia, genocides that took place not that long ago, even if we tend to forget the war that we suffer from Islam on the European territory that was started with the 11th of September in America, but that hit the sidewalks of Nice, London, and Spain. But the fact that, it's important is Zelensky didn't want a taxi, he wanted weapons. So we have a European there that said, I'm there, I'm going to stay there, and more than that, I'm going to fight. And this electroshock that he sent us made us become aware that even while we are, complaining and everything, that there were people very close to us that fought to live like we do, to live under the auspices of our liberal democracies. And that was a very important moment that we need to recall, that we need to be reminded of, that a lot of people live and are fighting to access liberal democracies. or the liberal democracy. Democracies that enable to live, to love, to create, to innovate, and to allow for this simple thing that looks like nothing, to vote, the simple capacity of voting. So I think hope is there. And in fact, Russia does not represent a threat, because we haven't seen lines of refugees trying to enter Russia to seek for the status of refugee. Same thing in Turkey. You don't have in these new fantasy empires, you don't have lineups of refugees that want to enter these countries. But we have people who line up because they want to access a better life for their children, better studies for their children. That's in Europe. So even though I was born in this country and that the mullahs really affected my parents and I ended up coming here, it's something fantastic for me to be here. But there is a movement in my country of origin. We tend to forget it. As a historian, I always go back to history. There were the student revolts in the 90s that were repressed, the Green Movement following the undue re-election of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad that caused the death of many. There was this moment of hope, incredible moment, at the signing of the Vienna agreements in 2015, and why the Iranian population was in the streets and was happy, because there was a promise of a liberalization of the economy in Iran. And they were ready, while the mullahs and the revolution keepers were not ready for that, because the mullahs and the keepers hold the gun and the economic weapon, because they hold 90% of the Iranian economy. The Tehran airport is at 90% of the ownership of the guardian of the revolution. So when they have this power, there's not much you can do. The Iranians hoped for reform. They revolted. And why do I say that it was a revolution? And even that the revolution has taken place in Iran. Why? Because a revolution, for it to happen, is you have to have a revolution of the mentalities. Monarchy, because it works based on a monarchy regime with mullahs instead of kings, fell off, collapsed in the mentalities, in the minds of the Iranians. They want to kick out these people from their thrones. Be reminded that in 1999, the Islamic Revolution took 17 months to take place. And the French Revolution, you should remember, started in Easter 1739, when Louis XV refused to confess and to take communion, which gave rise to a desacralization of his power as absolute monarch, enabled the libertarians that were just waiting for that to publish caricatures and things that enable up to the onset of the Republic to make religious absolutists collapse. I know I don't have much time, but and they managed little by little to overrun. Good news, this new Iranian revolution will take less time than the French Revolution, thanks to new technologies, thanks to the speed that changes everything. But a revolution is a revolution, and it always follows the same track. And what's important is the change of mentalities. I think that the revolution started when the first scarf was burned, when the women started dancing in the streets, when I saw school children, university students destroy the walls in the canteens that separated men and women. And this is what enables autocracies to survive. And based on the same model as the Iranian youth, we talk about a country where the youth is very strong, very present, I come from prehistory compared to this youth, and I'm thinking of this creativity, this desire for this of democracy of people in Taiwan, Hong Kong, in Burma, in Thailand, all this youth that has creativity in their democratic will, and that's quite moving. And this movement that started with a Thai comedian that spread out to the whole of Southeast Asia, which is the Milk Tea Alliance, the alliance of the milk tea. It's just a simple idea, a very simple claim, very symbolic. It says that in China you only drink black tea. The tea is black. In Taiwan, you always add milk. Oh, or tapioca. In Hong Kong, you add milk. In Thailand, very sweet and cold. In Burma, you drink it cold and sweet or with a cloud of milk. And the fact of joining this hashtag corresponded to ask for a change, to plead for singularity, a will to be who you are, what you are, be able to say what you want, and make claims. And that's what a liberal democracy is. It's praising singularity, the fact of being able to drink tea with tapioca pearls, for example, and even, I don't know if you follow in India, for example, 3 centuries of history of the Mughal period were erased from history books. So the Mughal emperors just disappeared from the schools in India. They were just erased. So when you tell the children who built the Taj Mahal, they'll say, oh, we don't know, because it was a Mughal emperor that built the Taj Mahal. In India, it's called the Masala Chai. They've joined this Milk Tea Alliance. It looks like nothing, but it summarizes very well what is a liberal democracy, what it means, what people are asking for. It's not much. I think we are really tired in our liberal democracy. We forgot the luck we have. We're here. We can say what we want for as long as you want, the way we want, and the only risk we have is not to be invited the year after. You know, this can happen. There'll be no torture, no jailing. There will be no police forces waiting for us to bring us into jail, to take us into jail. So this youth in Taiwan, in Hong Kong, that we have abandoned. We've abandoned to the extent that today the pro-Chinese government in Hong Kong proposes 1 million yuan. That's about 117,000 euros for any information enabling to bring back into the country refugees, Hong Kong refugees that are in Australia or England. But since Sweden is not in NATO yet, because Erdogan wants to get back his refugees, we're not there yet. Okay, we're a bit weak. Okay, yes, fine. But what's left to us? In the end, to mention the Marquis de Sade, I can say, okay, just another small effort to be proud of being liberal democracies. Thank you. So you all agree that we're starting pretty strong here, aren't we? And that we're in a situation of economic meeting that goes beyond the field of strict economy. So we have 20 minutes now. Open floor. Wonderful to have these 3 personalities that will be invited to come back next year, I promise. Lionel, it's not that you have the right, you're an owner here, you're a stakeholder here. So who wants to take the floor? I will appoint a person to ask the questions, to address the questions if we have no questions from the floor. Do we have anybody from the floor who has questions? Moon, what's your question? We have a raised hand. Please give a microphone to my friend, the president of Dauphine University. No microphone in the room? Oh my God. So you gave this a lot of thought, right? No, I didn't have time to give this. I played football or soccer, and it's a bit strange to be questioned by you. But I thought it was fascinating, these three presentations. Fascinating because really it's we're recreating hope here. We heard the recreation of hope, and I have one question to ask you is what are the solutions that you envisage today, whether on the uprising that we see in all the regions of the world that were crushed by whether in Arab countries, in Lebanon, Algeria, or in the places you mentioned that were crushed because of COVID, external variables, which led to the point that the movement stopped. But the hope is still there. How can we make it be reborn, heading for a better world with democracy? So it'd be interesting to have your point of view on this dynamic of hope. And on Africa also, very interesting what was said on Africa, the lack of knowledge we have on Africa. Why do we have this lack of knowledge? There are a lot of works, existing work that are very relevant on poverty in Africa, on a serious topics. Why do we always, what are your ideas to better know Africa? Thank you, that was exceptional for a football player. What I propose now is that you respond. Maybe Angela first. You've used up your time, so Angela, maybe you can take the floor. Answer this question first.
So I was trying to practice a little bit of human rights on the stage in fighting for the youth that's keeping time and gender equality in terms of airtime. And I just want to actually say really quickly before I attempt to answer your question, you spoke, if I've understood the translation correctly, about children and population. I think that's a really good point and a question to ask ourselves. Are we more concerned about being a great descendant or a fantastic ancestor? And as a psychologist, I speak to a lot of young people all the time, and their parents always tell me they must be going through a phase. They're so angry. I'm like, it's not a phase. They have legitimate reason to be angry, but I think they are the biggest source of hope. And for example, the fact that young people were officially recognized at COP27, and they really fought for that, is just inspiring. And I just wanted to say to your point, Your Excellency, that Martin Kimani, the permanent UN representative from Kenya, he made a very poignant defense on Ukraine's territorial integrity by, I'm paraphrasing, but essentially saying that we must rise from the dead embers of empires and make sure that a new form of oppression and dominance doesn't reoccur. So I really hear you and what you're saying about racism, and also the fact that inequalities are obviously increasing, and economics is a form and a pathway to human rights, but it's not the only way. And sometimes the narrative is between democracy or development, and it shouldn't be or, it should be and. And then to just try to attempt to answer your question. A lot of times, again, people will sort of bash human rights, but there's no other alternative framework that has the intellectual depth, the sophistication that's been enhanced over decades by almost all states, and that's been subjected to so much scrutiny. Our job in human rights is to protect progress, open up spaces, negotiate conflicts, and we are going to do that. And it's very important to reach a critical mass. 10% of the population, and it's a tipping point. And as a psychologist, again, I'll say that we have a fear factor, like our amygdala, understandably. So we're very hypervigilant to threat, also understandably. But we don't focus on all the wins, and it's a skewed, and the news and the media really capitalize that, but it's a skewed perspective of what's actually happening. Again, I have therapy clients that are very afraid to fly. Flying is safer than, driving in a car. And actually, my homework is go to the airport and watch for 3 hours how many planes take off and land safely. That's never covered. So again, that balance. But from a macro perspective, countries, states tend to vote in blocks. For example, South Africa is taking the lead at the UN on resolutions against racism. The EU is known for taking a lead on technology. But I think the future, we need Global North to genuinely listen openly about what they contribute, how they contribute, their part in the past, and we need broader, more diverse coalitions. And then I think that will be a much needed tipping point. And we have to, I think in this age of Insta everything, Insta dry cleaning, Instagram, we expect it like this. Obviously, if you're living in Ukraine, of course, you want the war to have ended yesterday. I get it. But we have to, in some ways, be content moving the needle even an inch. I live in Malaysia, and we have fought so hard for 15 years unrelentlessly to abolish the death penalty, and now we're there. So I guess I would just end my message by saying, do not give up hope. It's always a choice how we frame it. Are we descending into a black hole, or are we entering into a galaxy of stars? So when nothing is certain, everything is possible.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. President, so there are many favorable factors, I would say. There's more and more diversity in the actors of change. We're not locked up between national financial resources and public development aid. This is not a prison. We have very robust flows for the remittances, for example, of African migrants, which mobilize more resource than public development aid. And that's not debt. These are donations, remittances. And so these participants are more and more important. During the COVID, it was striking. In the countries of Maghreb, we had a growth, despite the recession, a world recession, an increase in the saving flows sent as remittances. And there were the philanthropists. The philanthropists have a systemic impact on change. Today, you take the Gates Foundation, the Bezos Foundation for Earth, the Rockefeller Foundation, philanthropists that is rising now is MasterCard Foundation, which is gaining momentum. All this is, from the U.S. for tax purposes, for fiscal reasons. But the reality is you don't understand the evolution of public health if you don't take into consideration what the Gates Foundation does. They spend more than the World Health Organization. So it's a coalition. And today on the green funding, we are establishing coalitions in which we invest philanthropists' money, so there's subsidies, not debt, to cover the first losses, funds that will be handed out, and private funding that expects a payback. But this coalition enables to lower costs. That'll be essential for energy transition, to cover the risk for long-term projects with a long-term payback. And there are new coalitions. The other factor to speed up change is the fact that you are no longer an actor, a researcher that is isolated somewhere in Benin, because the internet networks have also are now widespread between the CERN in Geneva and the American researchers and the people in Benin. And so today you're in real time, wherever you are, and you're a stakeholder of all innovations, of all progress, wherever you may be. And that's very important. And Africa is a continent where you need to create enterprises, endeavors. So it's a venture continent, a continent of startups, which are not isolated thanks to this connection and thanks to this revolution. So there are new tools to innovate. Lionel will hand over the floor to Luz. No, I think we are not interested in Africa because we lack knowledge. It looks like something we can't address. We are worried. I think if we, psychologically speaking, the human nature tends to boredom, and we have to re-excite this. You know, to speed up the process as to how to be very pragmatic. I think the problem is that autocracies manage to cut off the heads of the opposition. It's very difficult for those who oppose inside those countries, those autocracies, to survive. So those who survive migrate, and they keep sort of like a dead vision of the country of origin. They're sort of stopped at the moment they left the country, so they can't return, of course, because Hamid Karzai, for example, Afghanistan, despite the fact that he was extremely corrupt to the level of art, but he spent too long in Great Britain, and so he lost track of his country. Same thing in Iran. You know, we're playing the partition of the 1970s or 1990s, so the people have lost track. They don't follow the youth. They don't know how much their youth is connected. So I'll say something paradoxal. As a paradox, the CIA, we miss the CIA. In the time, you have the CIA inside the countries. They knew who was the opposition, who they needed to finance. The CIA. And they made a big mistake with the Taliban when they kicked out the Soviet Union. Made a big mistake, but they knew where to what to finance, where the finance should go. We saw that in Ukraine. You win if you have the weapons. So it's difficult to overthrow these regimes without a bloodshed. But I think we have to have an insight information, know who's can represent the future. The countries in Southeast Asia, the countries in Africa, Iran, for example. They have a highly educated youth, and they can represent tomorrow's political class. They have to be identified. They need to be funded, and stop imagining that yesterday can save tomorrow. The youth is there today, and that can work. Thank you. To conclude, first conclusion of the day, obviously the Rencontres d'Aix are not over. First conclusion, I would say we can be in the most difficult situation. Hope is always there. I propose we applaud the members of the panel. Not over. 4 sessions now in the different rooms, so you can go up the stairs, stay here.